we are on the scene. The race for the White House is heating up.
We're beating Biden.
How dare he say that?
If it's breaking news, we're live with the latest coverage. From the White House, the State Department, and Capitol Hill, we know the issues, but above all, we know the players to bring you the latest in-depth analysis on all the key stories that we're covering. I'm Eric Ham. Join me from Washington here on Firstpost America. Happy Friday and welcome to Firstpost America. I'm Eric Ham, coming to you live from the nation's capital in Washington, D.C. And over the next few minutes, we'll take you from the United States and around the world, covering all the top stories of the day. But before that, let's take a look at the latest headlines. Lebanon-based Hezbollah fires at least 100 rockets and 30 drones at Israel, making it the group's largest attack to date. According to Israeli officials, no casualties have been reported. Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi meets French President Emmanuel Macron and Britain's Prime Minister Rishi Sunak on the sidelines of the G7 summit in Italy. The leaders discussed space cooperation, defense, and climate action. Ukraine arrests at least 41 men trying to leave the country in an effort to evade mandatory military service. Last month, Kyiv introduced a new law banning men aged 18 to 60 from leaving the nation. The Philippines step up patrols in the South China Seas. This after China rolls out a no trespassing regulation allowing Beijing to detain foreigners entering the disputed waters for up to 60 days without a trial. And in South Africa, the African National Congress forms a coalition government with 3 other parties, including their rivals DA. Cyril Ramaphosa to continue as the president for a second term. We begin with the war in the Middle East. U.S. President Joe Biden says that he does not expect to reach a ceasefire deal in the near future because his proposal has not been completely embraced by Hamas. President Biden's comments came on the sidelines of the G7 summit in Italy, where he discussed the Gaza ceasefire with other member nations as well.
I've laid out an approach that has been endorsed by the UN Security Council, by the G7, by the Israelis. And the biggest hang-up so far is Hamas refusing to sign on, even though they have submitted something similar. Whether it now comes to fruition remains to be seen. We're going to continue to push. I don't have a final answer for you.
Now, President Biden's remarks come just days after Hamas responded to the proposal with its own amendments. The armed group wants Israel to withdraw from 2 critical corridors within the first week of the initial truce. Hamas is also asking that the Israeli troops pull out entirely from Gaza. And they're also demanding a complete halt to fighting before any exchange of Palestinian prisoners for Israeli hostages. Hamas also wants Russia, China, and Turkey to serve as guarantors and signatories to the ceasefire deal. Secretary of State Antony Blinken says the counterproposal from Hamas includes some demands that just are not acceptable.
We were waiting on one response, and that was the response from Hamas. And as the Prime Minister said, last night we received a response. Hamas has proposed numerous changes to the proposal that was on the table. We discussed those changes last night with Egyptian colleagues and today with the Prime Minister. Some of the changes are workable, some are not.
Notably, the original proposal called for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza and then the release of some Israeli hostages and Palestinian prisoners. Meanwhile, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who has insisted that he will not stop the war until he eliminates Hamas, is yet to publicly accept the deal. Now, further complicating the talks, a senior Hamas official said that no one has any idea how many of the remaining 120 hostages are actually alive in Gaza, and that any deal to release them must meet their ceasefire demands. Now, sources say Israeli and American intelligence are working together to locate and rescue the hostages. Now, with the ceasefire proposal hanging in the balance, Hamas is running out of time if it doesn't agree to President Biden's ceasefire proposal. Meanwhile, Israel continues to bombard Gaza in its quest to rescue the hostages and eliminate Hamas. And here in the United States, the race for the White House continues at a heated pace. Recently, convicted felon Donald Trump offered controversial ideas and made his return to Capitol Hill for the first time since the infamous January 6th insurrection, when he urged a mob of his supporters to attack the U.S. Capitol in an effort to overturn the presidential election of 2020. The former president is aiming to attract young voters with a new proposal. Days after pledging to alter federal laws to eliminate taxes, he's now putting forth the idea of implementing an all-tariff policy which would eliminate income taxes. Now, cutting down tax rates has been a long-time goal of the ex-president, and it also was the centerpiece of his 2016 economic plan. Now, elaborating on his tariff policy, the former president proposes to increase taxes on Chinese imports by 60% or more if reelected. Trump also visited the Capitol Hill Club to meet Republican lawmakers and business leaders, marking his first return to the area in 3 years.
Met, as you know, with the full House, Republican House today, and we had a tremendous meeting with them also, and there's great unity. Very similar, different topics actually, but not that different. And there's one thing in common: we want to make America great again.
Now, after meeting Donald Trump, Republican lawmakers expressed optimism about the former president's chances in the upcoming election. House Speaker Mike Johnson said he was confident that Republicans would flip several seats in November, but added that the party would not take anything for granted.
Extraordinary stable of candidates who are out there running great campaigns across the country. We will be working on a very aggressive agenda to fix all the great problems facing this country right now. We talked a little bit about that today with President Trump. We talked about how to grow this House majority and how he will help in doing so, and then how we'll help him as well. And this is a unified effort by the party. We're feeling good.
Now, after the Capitol Hill meeting, Donald Trump and the Republicans were slammed by Democrats who called the visit a moral collapse. Meanwhile, the former president incited another controversy as he called the city of Milwaukee horrible. Milwaukee, Wisconsin will host the Republican Party's presidential convention on the 15th of July. And Wisconsin is a key battleground state that both candidates are aggressively courting and need to win in order to retake the White House in November. Clearly, Trump's latest attack on Wisconsin's largest city will not go over well with voters in the state. And in a race that will go down to the wire, every vote counts. Moreover, with President Biden gaining in the polls since Trump's conviction, this latest criticism of a key battleground could create even more distance between the two rivals in the polls. And now moving to Italy, where the 50th G7 summit is currently underway. On Thursday, the group of industrialized nations agreed upon a $50 billion deal to fund Ukraine's war efforts through the interest accrued on seized Russian assets. Meanwhile, President Joe Biden signed a 10-year security pact with President Volodymyr Zelensky to strengthen Kyiv's defenses against Russian forces. China's economic and political ambitions are also in focus at the summit. Our next report gets you the latest updates from Italy.
The 50th edition of the Group of Seven or G7 summit has begun in southern Italy. It's being held at a luxurious resort in the city of Apulia, where Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni is hosting the leaders of more than a dozen countries. Now, the first thing on the agenda for the world's leaders was to double down on support for Ukraine in its war with Russia. The G7 countries have agreed upon a $50 billion deal to fund Kyiv through profits on frozen Russian assets. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has thanked the leaders for their support and said the funds will go towards both defense and reconstruction.
The key result for us is that there will be more air defense systems for our cities. Patriots is practically a Ukrainian word now. There will also be more equipment and other necessary supplies for the front. Decisions have been made regarding the use of Russian assets for the benefit of Ukraine, with the G7 taking a significant first step regarding $50 billion. Thank you.
Meanwhile, Zelensky met US President Joe Biden on the sidelines of the G7 summit, and the two nations signed a historic 10-year security pact that will strengthen Ukraine's defense against Russian forces and push it closer to a NATO membership.
President Zelensky and I have just now signed that agreement between the United States and Ukraine. Our goal is to strengthen Ukraine's credible defense and deterrence capabilities for the long term. A lasting peace for Ukraine must be underwritten by Ukraine's own ability to defend itself now and to deter future aggression anytime in the future.
President Biden said he also discussed a Gaza ceasefire with the G7 leaders to end Israel's 8-month war with Hamas. However, what became the highlight of the first day of the summit wasn't Biden's Ukraine deal or a Gaza ceasefire proposal, but yet another series of gaffes that netizens can't keep their eyes off. In one such instance, the US president appeared to lose his way. While world leaders were engrossed in a parachute display, Biden wandered off and started an impromptu conversation with an officer who was packing a bag. After this, Meloni had to step in and guide Biden back to his place, resulting in an uncomfortable moment during a group photograph. This wasn't the only awkward interaction between the two. In another goof-up, 81-year-old Biden was seen saluting Meloni and awkwardly shaking hands with her before she guided him to walk away. Joe Biden's missteps come just days after he was caught in a series of embarrassing situations during the D-Day ceremony in Normandy, prompting massive trolling and public slander. The latest blunders have further fueled ongoing discussions about Biden's cognitive health, with people even saying that Meloni had to babysit the American president. Some social media users also said that Biden is a total embarrassment on the world stage, while others pointed out it was normal for a person to act like this at his age. Now, the second day of the G7 summit will be focusing on China's political and economic ambitions, with migration and artificial intelligence also being on the agenda. Meanwhile, Pope Francis will become the first head of the Catholic Church to address the G7 summit, and the 3-day summit in Italy will end on Saturday.
And shifting focus to Latin America, China is constructing a megaport in a tranquil town on Peru's Pacific coast. China's state-owned Cosco Shipping will launch the $1.3 billion port later this year, and it will likely be inaugurated by Chinese President Xi Jinping during his first trip to the continent since the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, experts believe the port project will strain U.S.-China relations even further, all the while speeding up trade between Beijing and South American nations. Latin America could seek to embrace the surge of inexpensive Chinese goods, as the port in Peru would create opportunities for Beijing to expand its exports, including electric vehicles. Meanwhile, American officials fear that China's control of South America's first truly global commercial hub will allow Beijing to further strengthen its grip over the region's resources. The port would also allow China to deepen its influence among America's closest neighbors and eventually pave the way for Beijing to potentially install strategic military assets in the region. Over the past few years, China's investments in ports have given the country diplomatic leverage with nations in need of investment. Washington says the Chinese port in Peru could lead to increased debt similar to the situation seen in the African nations of Zambia and Ghana. The megaport has placed Peru squarely in the middle of the rivalry between the United States and China. And now, while Peru has embraced Chinese investments in various sectors, including shipping, copper mining, and electricity, Washington has expressed its concerns to Peruvian officials about Beijing's influence over critical infrastructure. Peruvian President Dina Boluarte will travel to China later this month to meet her Chinese counterpart, and the two leaders are scheduled to hold bilateral talks on the 28th of June. The Peruvian president is also expected to meet with executives from Cosco Shipping, Chinese telecom giant Huawei, and electric car maker BYD. And our final story today is about why women live longer and healthier lives than men. Globally, women outlive men by 5%. And it's been said that men don't outlive women due to their poor mental health and lifestyle. But now Japanese researchers claim to have scientific evidence that explains why women are winning the longevity race in the battle of the sexes. It all comes down to microscopic reproductive cells. Our next report explains.
Men and women are like apples and oranges in the vast orchard of human existence. And let's face it, the battle of the sexes is as old as time itself. Men and women differ in both physique and psyche, yet the comparisons and debates are never-ending. With each gender having its own set roles, the age-old question of who's better remains the elephant in the room. Take, for instance, the perpetual debates. Who whips up a better soufflé? Who can parallel park better? Whether it's women shattering the glass ceiling or men being branded as patriarchal oppressors, these discussions seem to go on and on. But in the vast ocean of gender comparisons, one question stands out. Who outlives whom? The answer is, drumroll please, women. And now, scientists may just have the scoop on why. It all boils down to the cells in our bodies, specifically our reproductive cells. Peek through a microscope and you'll see the stars of the show, the eggs and the sperms. These two, the biggest and the smallest cells respectively, are the unsung heroes of human reproduction. Japanese scientists, who are the Sherlocks of the scientific world, have discovered that reproductive cells hold the key to our lifespan. Their investigation involved the small turquoise killifish, a creature that hits puberty faster than a high school freshman and only lives for a few months. Despite its brief life, the killifish ages in a way that's eerily similar to humans. In their experiment, the Japanese team removed reproductive cells from the fish which would eventually become sperm or eggs, after which males and females started having identical lifespans. The removal of reproductive cells essentially leveled the playing field called life. The researchers said that having eggs gave females healthier tissues, and the lack of estrogen raised the risk of cardiovascular diseases in males. The conclusion was that there was enough evidence to conclude that sperm did in fact suppress lifetimes of males. It's already known that women live about 5% longer than men on a global scale. Various factors contribute to this gap. Young men are more likely to meet their maker through accidents or suicide, while women tend to lead healthier lifestyles.
Suicide every 2 hours, that there's 12 a day, there's 84 a week, that suicide is the single largest killer of men under 45. If you're an 18-year-old man in the UK, the most likely thing to kill you is you.
This life expectancy gap varies from country to country. In the UK, people born between 2020 and 2022 can expect to live 78.6 years if they're men and 82.6 years if they're women. Meanwhile, in Russia, men check out from Earth a whopping 13 years earlier than women. So the next time someone brings up the age-old debate of men versus women, remind them that, scientifically speaking, women have the upper hand in the longevity department. But whether it's cracking eggs or cracking the code of life, it seems that both genders bring something unique to the table. After all, in the grand symphony of life, every instrument has its part to play.
We thank you so much for tuning in today. We hope you have a great weekend, and we look forward to seeing you right back here next week. From impeachments to inaugurations, if it's a political story, we are on the scene. The race for the White House is heating up.
We're beating Biden.
How dare he say that?
If it's breaking news, we're live with the latest coverage. From the White House, the State Department, and Capitol Hill, we know the issues, but above all, we know the players to bring you the latest in-depth analysis on all the key stories that we're covering. I'm Eric Ham. Join me from Washington here on Firstpost America.